Trump has made these threats so many times that I don't think they have the same effect anymore. He repeatedly tries to present himself as strong, but after so many threats and so many broken promises, even many of his supporters no longer take them as seriously as they once did. And this is becoming a problem for him because the American economy is already facing serious difficulties. These problems did not begin with the current situation in West Asia. They have been developing for a long time, including in countries such as Japan. But the crisis in West Asia can make those existing problems much more severe and much more immediate.
From the Iranian perspective, this is also why it has become increasingly difficult to negotiate with Trump. When someone repeatedly makes commitments and then violates them, you cannot build a reliable agreement with that person. The clearest example was the MOU.
Trump signed it and then almost immediately undermined it, beginning with the very first article. So the problem is not simply whether Trump is making another threat today. The problem is that there is no longer much confidence that his commitments mean anything tomorrow. And while this is happening, the region itself is becoming increasingly dangerous. The Israeli regime has violated the ceasefire in Lebanon, Palestinians in Gaza continue to be killed, and tensions between Yemen and Saudi Arabia are rising after the bombing of Sana'a International Airport. We are also seeing serious tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iraq. All of these crises are developing simultaneously, and the Israeli regime remains the biggest obstacle to any attempt to reduce tensions across the region. At the same time, the global economy is moving closer and closer to a very dangerous point. And this is why I think the economic situation is becoming particularly dangerous. The problems are not limited to Iran or the United States. The global economy is interconnected, and when you create instability in a region as important as West Asia, the consequences spread very quickly. We have already seen how disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz and other regional shipping routes can affect energy markets, transportation, and the cost of doing business around the world. Recent reporting shows that tanker traffic through Hormuz has fallen sharply, while oil prices and shipping costs have risen amid continuing uncertainty. So when Trump threatens Iran with more pressure, he has to understand that economic warfare does not operate in only one direction. You cannot impose enormous costs on a country like Iran without creating costs for yourself and for your allies. This is particularly important because Iran has alternatives. It has relationships with Russia, China, Iraq, and other countries, and it has the ability to make the consequences of a confrontation much wider than Washington would like. And we should also understand that the region is not becoming unstable because Iran suddenly decided to create a crisis. There are multiple conflicts developing simultaneously. Yemen and Saudi Arabia are moving toward a more dangerous confrontation. Tensions involving Iraq are increasing. Lebanon remains extremely fragile, and Gaza continues to be devastated. The United States and Israel cannot simply deal with each of these problems separately because they are interconnected. That is why I believe we are approaching a very dangerous economic and political moment. The longer this continues, the greater the possibility that a regional confrontation becomes a global economic crisis. And this is why I think we have to look beyond the immediate military developments and understand the economic consequences. The United States is now talking about even greater economic pressure on Iran, but Iran has lived under sanctions for decades. Sanctions have created enormous difficulties, but they have not produced the political outcome Washington has repeatedly wanted. At the same time, the pressure is not one way. The disruption around the Strait of Hormuz is affecting the global energy system, and shipping through the strait has fallen dramatically. That means higher costs, greater uncertainty, and increasing pressure on economies far beyond West Asia. So when Washington says that it is going to impose the toughest sanctions imaginable, I don't think we should assume that Iran is simply going to surrender. The question is what happens to the United States and its allies if the confrontation continues and the economic consequences become increasingly difficult to absorb. This is particularly important because the Gulf states are also exposed. Their economies depend heavily on energy exports and on stable trade routes. They cannot simply separate themselves from what is happening in Iran, Yemen, Iraq, or the Strait of Hormuz. And this is why I keep coming back to the same point. There has to be a political solution. You cannot keep escalating militarily and economically while expecting the region and the global economy to remain unaffected. The longer this continues, the greater the danger that what began as a regional confrontation becomes a much broader economic crisis. And this is why I think the United States is facing a problem that is much larger than Iran itself. Washington can impose more sanctions, threaten more countries, and try to increase the economic pressure, but none of this changes the fundamental reality that the regional crisis is affecting the entire international economy. Look at the Strait of Hormuz. Before this conflict, roughly 1/5 of global crude oil and LNG shipments passed through this waterway. Now shipping traffic has fallen to only a handful of vessels a day. So when Trump says that the United States has control over the strait, the question is not what he says. The question is what is actually happening. The ships are not moving normally, insurance costs have increased, energy markets are under pressure, and countries throughout Asia and Europe are feeling the consequences. and now Washington is talking about what it calls the toughest sanctions in history. But Iran has already lived under sanctions for decades. The Iranian people have suffered from them, but Iran has also learned how to survive under this kind of pressure. The danger is that the United States may believe economic pressure will force Iran to surrender, while Iran believes that time is working against the United States and its allies. That is why I think we are approaching a very dangerous moment. If the confrontation continues, the question is no longer simply whether Iran can withstand sanctions. The question is how much economic damage the United States and the rest of the world are willing to absorb before they recognize that there has to be a political solution. There are two possible directions from here. One is continued escalation, and the other is for the Americans to recognize that they have to bring this situation to an end. The pressure is becoming more difficult for them. The shortage of oil is intensifying, and the problems are not limited to the Persian Gulf. The situation in the Red Sea is also contributing to the crisis, while Iran is preventing the Emirates from exporting through the region. So the economic pressure is spreading well beyond Iran. But even if an agreement between Iran and Oman is finalized, and the issue of the Strait of Hormuz is addressed, that does not mean the war is finished. The United States still has obligations under the MOU. The blockade has to end. There are questions concerning Lebanon, Gaza, the West Bank, and compensation for the damage caused to Iran. For Iran, these are not separate issues. The MOU already provides a framework for addressing them, and Iran is saying that it will not compromise on the commitments that were made. Compensation does not necessarily have to mean that Washington simply transfers money from American bank accounts to Tehran. There are other possible mechanisms involving assets and financial arrangements in the West and the Persian Gulf. The central issue is that Iran is no longer negotiating from the same position it had before the war. The balance has changed. Iran believes it has demonstrated that military pressure cannot force it to surrender, and that reality has to be recognized if there is going to be a lasting agreement. And this is why I don't think the United States can simply continue with the same policy and expect a different outcome. Iran has already demonstrated that it can absorb enormous pressure and continue functioning, while the costs of the confrontation are spreading to the countries that depend on the region for energy and trade. The United States also has to understand that Iran is not negotiating from a position of desperation. Iran has its own leverage, particularly through the Strait of Hormuz and through its relationships with other countries in the region. If Washington continues to use threats instead of serious negotiations, it risks making the economic situation much worse. And there is another important point. The longer this confrontation continues, the more difficult it becomes for the United States to control its consequences. A crisis that begins with Iran can quickly involve Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, the Gulf states, and the global energy market. Once those different fronts become connected, nobody can simply decide that the conflict should stop. So I think the Americans have to make a choice. They can continue believing that Iran will eventually surrender under pressure, or they can recognize that the balance has changed and begin looking for a genuine political solution. For Iran, an agreement has to mean something. It cannot be another document that is signed today and violated tomorrow. If there is going to be peace, there has to be trust backed by concrete actions. Otherwise, we are going to continue moving toward a much larger crisis, and eventually the economic consequences will become impossible for the United States and its allies to ignore.